Good morning. Welcome to the Indiana Department of Education webinar series covering the new Student-Centered Accountability System. This presentation will provide an overview of the Indiana model of student growth, how it is calculated, and how it factors into the new Student-Centered Accountability System. My name is Brenda Earps, and I am the Assistant Director of Accountability for the Indiana Department of Education. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them to School Accountability, all one word, at doe.in.gov. We have staff monitoring that email box and will answer as many questions as we can. This presentation will cover the following topics. Why is it important to look at student growth? What is the Indiana model of student growth? How do we measure student growth in Indiana? And how does the Indiana model of student growth fit into the A to F calculation? Growth, in other words, student learning, is obviously important. Up to 50% of a school's grade depends on it. But the Indiana model of student growth is more than just important. It is complex, and I dare say scary for some people, because it is perceived to be very complex. This is the reason we have devoted an entire webinar to just the growth domain. Student growth is important because it quantifies student learning and identifies the benefits that a particular school has had upon a student. The fact that a student passed an exam in a given year does not give you any more information than a snapshot in time. Let's use an analogy. We tell 4 people they need to meet me on the east steps of the State House in Indianapolis at 9 a.m. on Monday. At 9 a.m. on Monday, we can tell whether or not they made it. That is like the performance domain. They made it or they didn't. A student passed or they didn't. But just saying you made it or you didn't doesn't take into account what it took to get you to the State House by 9 a.m. Did you have to get up early? Did you have to drive far? For someone who lives in the suburbs of Indianapolis and commutes daily into Indianapolis, it probably isn't a big deal to be at the State House by 9 a.m. On the other hand, someone who lives in Fort Wayne or Terre Haute would have to get up much earlier and drive much further. Someone who lives in Evansville may even drive up the night before just so they wouldn't have to get up so early. If we want to acknowledge everyone's effort to get to the State House by 9 a.m., even if they fell short of the end goal, then we would need to come up with a metric that measures the effort that was expended. If the performance domain measures whether or not a student passed the test or made it to the State House on time, then growth is what we use to quantify the effort expended or the amount of increase in academic knowledge gained. For students taking ISTEP, growth is the metric that is used to gauge the amount of increase in academic knowledge that got the student to the point they are today. The Indiana model of student growth provides us with a mechanism to assess how much learning has occurred amongst students at a school in the last year. The Accountability Panel, which was convened to design the new Student-Centered Accountability System, agreed upon a set of core values that they felt the growth domain needed to adhere to. A few of those key values were: growth should be a unique metric, independent of performance status. In other words, a student's current year pass, did not pass status should not factor into the growth metric. Growth should incentivize progress toward proficiency in non-proficient students and continued growth in proficient students. Growth should deter a decline in individual student performance levels. In order to ensure that the values of the Accountability Panel are being met, a growth to proficiency table with 3 main components was created. The first component is the prior year status, which is broken into 3 categories. The did not pass category is broken into 3 subcategories: did not pass 1, did not pass 2, and did not pass 3. The goal for students with prior year status of did not pass is to catch up, in other words, to become proficient. The pass category, which is broken into 3 subcategories, pass 1, pass 2, and pass 3. The goal for students with a prior year status of pass is to move up to a higher proficiency level. The final category is Pass Plus, which is broken into two subcategories, Pass Plus 1 and Pass Plus 2. The goal for students with a prior year status of Pass Plus is to keep up, in other words, to continue to be Pass Plus. The next component of the growth to proficiency table is a target range. The target range utilizes the observed student growth percentile, which we will discuss more in a later slide. The target range is broken into three categories. Low movement. On average, students in this category are sliding backward a prior year status subcategory. Standard movement. On average, students in this category are staying in the same status subcategory as they were in the prior year. And high movement. On average, students in this category are moving up a status subcategory, moving up or catching up. Please note that the target ranges will need to be adjusted annually until the test stabilizes. 3 to 4 testing years are needed for this to occur. The final component of the growth to proficiency table is the points awarded. This led to the following list of principles. Students who were not passing, who are catching up, should get the most points. Students at least passing who are moving up should get more than 100 points. Students at least passing who are keeping up should get 100 points. Students who were not passing who are keeping up should get points but not 100 points. Students, regardless of their prior pass status, who are not keeping up should not get as many points as those that are keeping up. Students who are not previously passing who are not keeping up should not get any points. These principles were translated into the growth to proficiency table that the State Board of Education approved at their April 2016 meeting. Along the left side are the 8 prior year status categories. You will note that the cut scores for Pass 1 and Pass Plus 1 were approved by the State Board of Education last fall. The cut scores for the other categories were determined by examining the 2014-15 ISTEP results for natural breaks in the data and are set by grade level and content area. The cut scores can be found in the school accountability community on Learning Connection. The distribution of points was approved by the State Board of Education using the principles described on the previous slide. The standard movement target ranges are set for each prior year status category to ensure that most students who maintained the same status category fall into the standard movement. In other words, these students who were in a passing category last year are keeping up. Those who were in a did not pass category aren't doing any worse, but they aren't doing significantly better either. Students with observed growth percentiles higher than the standard movement target range are generally moving up or catching up in the case of the students who did not pass the prior year. Students with observed growth percentiles lower than the standard movement target range are generally not keeping up. Now let's look at an example of how to use the growth to proficiency table. In example 1, the student had a prior year status of Pass 3 and a growth percentile of 56 this year. This results in a point value of 100 points. This student is keeping up. In example 2, the student had a prior year status of did not pass 1 and a growth percentile of 23 this year. This results in a point value of 0 points. Before we get into how the individual student points affect a school's growth domain score, let's talk about which students get a growth score. Only those students who were counted in the performance domain for a given school are counted. So these are the students that were educated 90% of the year at your school, in other words, enrolled for 162 days, and who tested at your school. The student needs to have a valid ISTEP score in the given year. So for the 2015-16 ADA F grades, they must have a valid 2015-16 ISTEP score. If they have a valid I-STAR score, they are not counted. The student needs to have a valid ISTEP score in the previous year for the immediately preceding grade. This is why growth is not calculated for third graders. They did not take the ISTEP the previous year. The exception to this is growth for 10th graders in 2016-17 school year. These students will need a valid 8th grade ISTEP score from the 2014-15 school year. Please note that growth will not be calculated for 10th grade for the 2015-16 school year, as these students did not take the college and career readiness version of ISTEP in the 8th grade. In order to calculate the growth domain, we need a total of 40 students in the school. We also need at least 10 eligible students in the bottom 25% category to calculate the growth domain for a school. Next, let's cover how the list of bottom 25% and top 75% is determined. Keep in mind that for each school, this calculation is repeated for each grade and content area combination as we calculate a school's growth domain score. First, we count the number of eligible students in that grade, so students that were counted in the performance domain and have 2 consecutive years of ISTEP scores. Then we divide that number by 4 to determine how many students will be in the bottom 25%. For example, if we have 100 students, we would divide 100 by 4 to arrive at 25 students in the bottom 25%. We then rank order the list of eligible students by the previous year's ISTEP result, low to high. Once the students are ranked, we find the scale score that corresponds to the student number found in Step 2. If we have decided that 25 students are in the bottom 25%, then we will find the scale score that corresponds to the student who is 25th from the top of the list. Finally, we include all students with a scale score equal to or lesser than Step 4 in the bottom 25% list. All other students in this grade are considered top 75%. Let's go over a quick example of how the bottom 25% and top 75% are determined. Imagine that in school ABC's 5th grade, there are 40 eligible students. In other words, there were 40 students who were included in the performance domain and had valid ISTEP scores in 2014-15 from the 4th grade and valid ISTEP scores in 2015-16 from the 5th grade. I have rank ordered them from low to high, with student 1 having the lowest 4th grade math scale score of 303, and student 40 having the highest 4th grade math scale score of 725. Next, I will take 40 and divide it by 4 to determine how many students will be in the bottom 25%. So I now know that I will have a minimum of 10 students in the bottom 25%. I find student 10 and find that the student had a scale score of 393. I now know that a scale score of 393 is a cutoff for being in the bottom 25%. In other words, all students with a 4th grade scale score of 393 or lower will be in the bottom 25%. I then mark all students with a 4th grade scale score less than 393. You will notice that in the example, student 11 also had a 4th grade scale score of 393. So that student is included in the bottom 25% as well. All other students are considered in the top 75%. I have now determined the bottom 25% and the top 75% of students for the 5th grade in math at school ABC. This process would be repeated for all grades at School ABC and for English Language Arts. Now that we understand which students will be included for growth, we can discuss how the individual student points factor into the growth domain for a school. The process is the same for English Language Arts and for math. First, we use the Growth to Proficiency table to determine a score for all students. Then we break the students into two groups, bottom 25% and top 75%. Remember, this is done for each school individually and looks at the previous year's ISTEP score. Once we have broken the students into the two categories, we find the average growth score for each category. So we end up with an average growth score for the bottom 25% students and the top 75% students. The average growth score for the bottom 25% students is averaged with the average growth score for the top 75% students to determine the growth score for each content area, English Language Arts and Math. The growth score for the two content areas are then averaged together to determine the overall score. Let's look at an example of how the overall growth calculation works for example School A. Looking first at English Language Arts, we start with the bottom 25%. These are the students who are eligible to be counted in the growth calculation for example School A, that when we rank ordered their English ISTEP scores from last year, were at the bottom 25% for their grade. We found 51 of these students, and when we added up the point totals for all of these students, we came up with 4,400 points. Dividing 4,400 points by 51 will give us an average of 86.3 points. If we repeat this procedure for the 151 top 75% of students, we get 14,450 points. Dividing 14,450 by 151 gives us an average of 95.7 for the top 75% of students. We then add the 86.3 and the 95.7 to arrive at 182 points. To find the average, we divide by 2 to get 91.0 points for English Language Arts growth, for example, School A. To calculate the overall growth score, we average the English Language Arts growth score and the math growth score together. Using the previous example, English Language Arts is 91.0 points, and math is 89.2 points. Math was calculated the same way, we just calculated English Language Arts. We add the 91.0 points for English Language Arts and the 89.2 points for math and come up with 180.2 points. To calculate the overall growth score, we divide by 2. There are two content areas, after all, to arrive at an average of 90.1. This value is then utilized in the calculation of the overall A to F grade. Now that we have an understanding of how the Growth to Proficiency table will be used, let's take a step back and discuss the target range in a little more detail. The target range refers to a student's observed growth percentile and is shown on a scale from 1 to 99, low to high. Ideally, we need 4 years of data on an assessment to create a reliable student growth baseline to compare the students against. 2015-16 is only the second year of data on the college and career readiness version of ISTEP. The baseline will utilize criterion referenced analysis. Until the baseline can be established, however, we will look at a student's current year performance compared to other students with similar test histories. A student's entire test history is used in the analysis, not just the previous year. This allows students to be compared to their academic peers and allows all students the same opportunity to achieve a high growth score. target ranges will be analyzed annually until the test stabilizes to ensure that the principles of the growth to proficiency table are still being adhered to. Even though the growth domain will not be calculated for 2015-16 for grade 10, a discussion on the growth domain would not be complete without discussing 10th to 12th grade improvement. Since the growth domain will not be calculated for 2015-16 for grade 10, the 10th to 12th grade improvement will not be calculated until 2016-17 either. 10th to 12th grade improvement is calculated separately for English Language Arts and for math. 10th to 12th grade improvement is essentially a bonus opportunity that rewards moving students who were not proficient on the English Language Arts and/or math graduation qualifying exam in the 10th grade to being proficient by the 12th grade. Please note that we are using the term graduation qualifying exam to mean both the end of course assessment, or ECA, or the graduation qualifying exam, depending on the exam in place for the particular graduating class. 10th to 12th grade improvement is simply the difference in pass percentage for the same cohort of students between their 10th grade year and their 12th grade year, multiplied by 10. There must have been a minimum of 10 students who had not passed the graduation qualifying exam by the end of their 10th grade year to be eligible for the 10th to 12th grade improvement bonus. 10th to 12th grade improvement utilizes the same cohort of students as the multiple measures domain. Let's look at an example of 10th to 12th grade improvement. Let's say that 91% of students in the 2015 graduation cohort at high school XYZ passed the math graduation qualifying exam by the end of grade 12. 76% of the students in the 2015 graduation cohort at high school XYZ had passed the math graduation qualifying exam by the end of their 10th grade year. So we take 75.0% and subtract it from 91.0%, which equals 15%. Multiplying 15% by 10 yields 1.5 points. These points are then added to the math growth score for the school. English Language Arts is calculated in the exact same way. This fall, when reviewing your new 2016 Student-Centered Accountability Report Card, please keep the following in mind. Students who had undetermined test scores during the 2014-15 administration of ISTEP will not be included in the 2016 growth calculation. Remember, we need 2 consecutive years of ISTEP data to calculate growth for a particular student. Growth will not be calculated for 10th graders for 2015-16. So growth will not be included for grades 9 through 12 in the 2015-16 accountability report cards. You can contact us at any time by emailing schoolaccountability@doe.in.gov. We also encourage you to join the School Accountability community on Learning Connection to make sure you get the latest announcements and have access to other pertinent information. Lastly, we ask that you complete our survey to let us know how we can make future webinars better. There is a link in the School Accountability community on Learning Connection in the recent announcements, as well as the link is shown on this slide. Thank you for participating in our webinar, and have a nice day.